Act 4 of our history of European integration starts with de Gaulle's resignation in 1969 and takes us through the 1970s. De Gaulle is succeeded in France by his former Prime Minister, Georges Pompidou, who comes to power at roughly the same time as the new German Chancellor, Willy Brandt. And these two men are the key leaders at the summit held at Den Haag in the Netherlands at the end of 1969. And the summit at Den Haag agrees on three major principles: completion, enlargement or widening, and deepening. Completion first. This essentially meant getting the common agricultural policy on a sound and more or less automatic financial footing. The common agricultural policy at this point is covering about 70% of the total budget of the EEC. Widening, of course, means lifting the French veto on British entry and starting negotiations with the UK and the other candidate states with a view to their joining the Six. And indeed, negotiations are opened with the UK, with the government of Edward Heath in 1970, and they lead to the entry of the UK as well as the Republic of Ireland and Denmark, not as it happened with Norway, had been a candidate state but eventually decided to stay out, but the other three enter on the 1st of January 1973 and the Six become 9. Deepening referred to European political cooperation. That is the notion that the nations of the economic community should attempt to coordinate their foreign policies a bit more closely, at least at senior civil servant level. This last aspect didn't play out terribly decisively, in particular when the economic crisis broke with the oil price rise in late 1973, early 1974. The different countries of the European Economic Community reacted in rather different and not very coordinated ways. The first test of political cooperation appears to me to have been rather a failure. And when Pompidou and Brandt depart the scene in the spring of 1974, Pompidou tragically through an early death, Willy Brandt through a scandal involving an East German spy in his own private office, the world is really rather a different place from that of Den Haag less than 5 years before. The oil crisis has plunged the world economy into its most serious difficulties really since the post-war period, and at the same time the end of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates between the world's major currencies has destabilized the world's monetary system, because suddenly currencies are floating freely against one another according to what the markets decide they're worth, rather than having their values against one another fixed by governments and underpinned by a stable dollar, as had been the case under the Bretton Woods system set up in 1944. Bretton Woods goes in 1971, and this new monetary instability is a major factor of instability in the world economy in the 1970s. Now, Pompidou and Brandt are succeeded by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in France and by Helmut Schmidt in West Germany. And they shape very much the agenda of the European Economic Community through the rest of that rather difficult and unstable decade. Neither man is a strong ideological pro-European. Indeed, in some ways, they put their faith in nation states more than in the institutions of Europe. But they're also rather practical politicians, and they understand each other very, very well. They're both very bright former finance ministers. They're both, incidentally, still alive in 2017, both well into their 90s. Now, in some ways, the 70s are looked on as a rather sort of doldrums period in the history of European integration. But actually, that's not quite true. There are three things that happen in the 70s, which are, I think, of considerable importance. One of them starts in 1974, and that is the creation of the European Council. Effectively, institutionalised summits between the heads of government, or in the case of France, the head of state, because the president runs the government, of the different member states. This is an initiative of Giscard d'Estaing, backed up by Schmidt, based on the notion initially that if only the heads of government could get together and talk informally about the issues concerning Europe, then they'd be easier for the institutions to sort out. And these informal meetings gradually took the name of European Council, which it still has. Now, you might think, well, the creation of a European Council is another sign of European integration, and to a certain degree you'd be right, but it's very much an intergovernmental sort of integration. It's not about giving more power to the Commission, it's about making sure that the heads of government and heads of state retain the ultimate power within the organisation, even initially on an informal basis. So the European Council is not the same as the Council of Europe, it's not the same as the Council of Ministers. It comes into being in 1974 and has been with us ever since. Second new institutional initiative is the development of the European Parliament. You'll remember from the earlier acts that the European Assembly, as it was called, consists of delegates of the parliaments of the respective member states, and they have very little power. They can form opinions, but they can't actually stop anything happening or start anything happening. The European Parliament begins to get a little power over the budget in the 1960s. And from 1979, after decisions taken shortly after 1974, it gains a new degree of legitimacy because in 1979, for the first time, the European Parliament is directly elected by the voters of the member states. At the time, commentators like David Marquand in the UK think this is great because it's going to solve the problem of the so-called democratic deficit of the European Economic Community. That is, an economic community that's more about decisions taken by Eurocrats and about decisions taken by the Commission and about decisions taken about ministers, and not enough about popular input. The European Parliament, it was hoped, would resolve this problem, would rebalance the institutions towards the peoples of Europe. It has to be said that by and large it hasn't fulfilled these hopes because European elections have attracted traditionally rather low turnouts, and the campaigns on European elections have been very much to do with national political issues rather than the future of Europe. Still, the directly elected European Parliament has been there since 1979. Third initiative of the 1970s is the development of not yet monetary union, but of a European monetary system, designed to contain those fluctuations of currencies against one another within limits. After all, when you think about it, it's awfully difficult for a business to do business with lots of European partners if the values of currencies are going up and down like yo-yos. The European monetary system attempts to contain these fluctuations within a sort of tunnel, one of the similes that's used is the snake in the tunnel, in order to make life a bit more predictable for European businesses. Within the European monetary system, the anchor currency very quickly becomes Western Europe's strongest currency, in other words, the Deutschmark. And the central banks of the member states of the monetary system commit themselves to intervene, that's to say, to buy the currency of a state whose currency is under attack from the markets. The European monetary system is clearly the ancestor of the euro. It's the beginnings of it. It's put together by these two former finance ministers, Helmut Schmidt and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. It also is presided over for a brief time by the only ever British President of the European Commission, that is Roy Jenkins, also himself a former finance minister. So the 1970s are a picture of, in some respects, relative quietude on the European front, but of three major institutional developments, and also, of course, of the enlargement towards Britain and Ireland and Denmark. The 1970s also see the democratization of southern European countries, Spain, Portugal and Greece, in a series of peaceful revolutions in 1974 and 1975. And of course they're going to be the next states to join the economic community, making the 9 into 12 by 1986. That's the end of Act 4.